on Bhayabherava, first we saw that there are many important reasons why we select this sutta. There you see, first of all, that it is an autobiographical account of the Buddha. We should be interested, if we are followers of Buddha, to know how in the life of the Buddha himself, how he struggled. First, as an ordinary human being like you and I, and the problems that he went through, the sincere effort that he put forward, and the difficulties that he overcame, and how he did it. So, looking for materials that are autobiographical is a very important part of our experience, of our attempt to learn as Buddhist. And you suddenly see a good example in this particular sutta. The Buddha tells of how he reflected about the whole question of fear. And this fear is not just in a very simple sense, you might say it. It's about fear in a fundamental sense. Nowadays we talk a lot about psychological problems, and people seem to be, as I said, I have said on many occasions, out of proportion in their preoccupation with so-called psychological problems. And particularly they love the label of depression. Everybody talks about depression. And I think it's good. It's good to be aware of it, to be mindful of it, and that is a human situation, human predicament. But that we mustn't be bogged out by it. Mustn't be overwhelmed by this kind of negative preoccupation. So this is the common situation today we see, for instance, in a society like Hong Kong, a highly educated society and a center of commerce. You know, people are well-to-do and they live comfortable life, and they have good Western education. They're fully, or at least highly Westernized, and along with that, a lot of problems. Often problems that are not the Asian ones, but they have been transported, they have been borrowed from the process of Westernization. Today, I think you have to decondition yourself and come back to the Asian wisdom, the Buddhist wisdom of learning about life, understanding your psychological problems as human beings. So when you come to the sutta like this, like the Bhayabherava Sutta, you come to the Buddha's wisdom, the Buddhist wisdom of dealing with fear or the experience of insecurity in the deeper sense, the most fundamental sense. We saw at the beginning that a Brahmin is commenting on the lifestyle, on the practices of the Buddha and other Sramanas. So you see the contrast between the Brahmana and the Sramana mentality. Brahmana, Sramana together represent the whole religious of India, in ancient time as well as in modern time. And we know that the Brahmanas or the Brahmins represent the householding camp, if you like, and the Sramana represents the came of the renunciates. And Buddhism and the Buddha belong to the lineage of the Shramana. So you see a Brahmana, a Brahmin asking questions and expressing his doubt about the practice, the way of the Shramanas. And the first thing is that the Brahmin saw that his Shramana, the recluse, or these recluses, if you use an English translation, this is one possible one for Shramana, mostly dwell in the forest. They live a simple life of detachment. It is as if the Brahmin representing his tradition cannot help inquiring into why they chose this, the recluses, the Shramana chose this lifestyle, and what was the benefit, and so on. Now, at the beginning, the Brahmin commented that, I see that, or it can be interpreted in the form of a question, or is it that you, Venerable Gautama, you are, there are four questions, or you can say 4 emphatic points made by the Brahmin. It depends on how you read the read the sentences. By the way, in the Pali, it can be interpreted as questions, but in the Chinese, corresponding Chinese translation, you don't see the questions there. You see just emphatic remarks, and on 4 points. One is that the Buddha was a leader, was leading in front. Secondly, the Buddha was one who benefited spiritually the followers. Thirdly, a very important one, is that the Buddha was one who inspired. He was an inspirer. Of the disciples. So remember what I have asked you to note. Samadapeti is the verb form, and Samadapeta is the agent noun form, the inspirer. Note that word is very important. It represents the approach of the Buddha. It represents the approach of Buddhism. And then fourthly, the Brahmin said, remarked or asked the question that is it that the people look up to the Buddha as their example. And we saw a word there in the form of a compound, ditta nukati apachati. Apachati means to fall into, to enter into, and so on. And then the compound ditta anukati is made into the accusative form because of the word getting into. And how do we interpret the word ditta and anukati? Two components there. And when we look into modern translations, most of them will say it means ditti and anukati. That is, anukati means literally following. pursuing. And it can be interpreted in the sense of conforming to, going along with anu. And the first component is usually understood to be ditti, which means usually translated as view. Only one translator that I know of, that is Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, remarked that he believed that in fact it should be understood as ditta and not ditti. Ditta and anukati. The only thing is that in Pali, when you have ditti, e, first word ending e, and the next component starting with and joined together, you see also ditta. Well, at least this is one common form. But when you have ditta and anukati, you also can see ditta. So there's always ambiguity in a Prakrit like Pali. But Bhikkhu Bodhi, I think quite rightly, points out that he believes the first component is ditta, meaning seen. So, what is seen of the teacher, i.e., the example, the behavior of the teacher. So, that would mean the people, the followers, look up to the Buddha and look at his example, his life, and follow his example. And we saw that, of course, the Chinese doesn't have very much in understanding this compound, which is which. But certainly, to say the least, there is no indication of the idea of just a view, the idea of ditti as view. We don't see that in the Chinese. I have quoted several examples from other contexts, other texts, where this same compound is used. But in those other examples, we see clearly the idea, the point is actually not about just ditti in the sense of view, but it does really indicate the idea of example, following the example, following the manner of behavior. That is the kind of senses. To save time, I'm not going to repeat those examples. I've given several examples from the Pali sources. And also last night I pointed out that even from the commentary, we saw that it's true that the commentary also seemed to, that is a commentary on the Majjhima Nikaya, also seemed to interpret the compound as coming from ditti and anukati. The word ditti does occur, but nevertheless, it's so clear that in the explanation, it speaks of the people following the Buddha in terms of the way he looks at things, ditti, young, dittiko. And then also in terms of his kanti, young, kantiko. And also in terms of his ruchi, that means inclinations. So, although the commentaries seem to also take ditti as the first component of the compound, in their understanding interpretation, it goes far beyond just a matter of views. So the people look up to the Buddha in his vision, in the way of seeing things. This is one, but kanti means here it means receptivity. His insight, his receptivity to truths, and more importantly, his ruchi, his inclinations. So, when you look at the explanation of that, it's clear that ditti is understood in a much broader sense than just simply a view, even by the Pali commentators. So when you look at all these data together, you can see the whole idea in the fourth comment, the fourth point emphasized by the Brahmin, the whole idea is that the Buddha is the role model. He consciously, he's aware of his life and example as a source of inspiration for the later people. So if we understand that, we have to bear this in mind all the time when we read the suttas and we understand, particularly the autobiographical accounts in the Buddha's teaching, why he did like that. For instance, in this case, why he chose to live so much of his life in the forest. And of course, towards the end of the sutta, we're going to come to it. It will take a couple of weeks more before we come to the end. We saw that, in fact, the question was asked again and link up the beginning part. And the Buddha said that, or the sutta said that some people might think, oh, the Buddha is not really, he's not fully perfected spiritually and psychologically, because he may be having desire and fears and hatred. That's why he had to still live in the forest. And the Buddha answered, no, I do that out of a twofold consideration. One is, of course, for myself, the spiritual benefit of living a life of detachment and simplicity in the forest, right, provides the experience of peace and harmony. But at the very same time, I'm conscious of myself as an example for the later generation. In other words, when the later generation looks up to the Buddha, and when they see that the Buddha prefers to live a simple life, such as the life of a forest. Today you may not literally be able to live the forest, but at least in principle, the idea of simplicity, the idea of detachment, exemplified by a life of the forest. I think that the spirit should be borne in mind. So when we look up to the Buddha, we realize that in the value, you might say, the structures of his teaching, you see that he emphasizes simplicity, detachment, and minimum complexity, involvement in his life. And what is important is not the external materialistic kind of satisfaction, but the inner peace and calm. It goes back to the whole point about this sutta on the whole question of security or insecurity. What we want to overcome is the inner problem of insecurity. What we want to achieve is psychological or spiritual security. And in Buddhism, last night I pointed out that this ideal is often represented by the word cane, or yoga cane. It's a term that is, especially the latter term, is not easy to translate, but I would render it as spiritual security. Often this is made a synonym for Nibbana. So the root of psychological problems, the root of the sense of fear, the root of the experience of depressions are all from within us. And to overcome that, we have to transform ourselves from within. It's not a question of trying to master, to conquer the outside. And not a question of just taking one aspirin after another. You may need to take the aspirins, of course, from time to time as a temporary, measure of relief. But ultimately, the true solution lies within us. That's what we get, the inspiration we get from the suttas. So the Buddha says that he is aware of this twofold purpose of living the forest. For himself, that is to say, in terms of, it's another way of looking at it, is to say that it's in terms of his own spiritual benefit at the same time, and also in terms of benefiting others. And for a true individual, as exemplified in the case of a perfected being, fully enlightened being, the Buddha, ultimately, spiritually speaking, self-benefit is the same as benefiting others. Other benefit is the same as self-benefit. The two are fully integrated. They are not split, unlike in the case of we enlightened beings. So that's a very powerful inspiration, powerful message that you should be able to get by reading this sutta. And we have just dealt with the first part of it. There's a lot more to follow, and we shall continue to share in the next 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks.